On May 27, 1940, the tactical landscape of the European theater was defined by a single, overwhelming doctrine known as blitzkrieg. The German Wehrmacht was executing a pincer movement designed to annihilate the British expeditionary force at the port of Dunkirk. This form of warfare was built entirely on industrial volume and mechanical velocity. The battlefield was dominated by the mechanical roar of Maybach 12-cylinder engines, powering the Panzer Mark IV tanks. It was dominated by the wind-driven sirens of the Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, designed specifically to induce psychological paralysis before their 500-kilogram bombs even impacted the earth. It was dominated by the Maskenengewehr 34, the MG-34, firing 7.92 mm rounds at a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute. In 1940, noise was the primary instrument of control. Volume equaled suppression. But in a damp drainage ditch near the French village of Épinay, Captain Jack Churchill was preparing a weapon that operated on a completely different physical principle. He was 33 years old, commanding a company of the 2nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment. While his men were nervously cleaning the bolts of their Lee Enfield No. 4 rifles and counting their remaining .303 caliber ammunition, Jack was applying beeswax to the string of a 6-foot-long English longbow. This was not a ceremonial item. It was a war bow made of Spanish yew wood with a draw weight of over 100 pounds. To understand the lethality of this weapon in the context of modern warfare, one must understand the physics involved. To hold the string at full draw, Jack had to exert continuous force equivalent to lifting a heavy artillery shell with 3 fingers. The potential energy stored in the bent limbs of the yew wood was capable of propelling a heavy steel-tipped arrow at 200 feet per second. His fellow officers viewed this equipment with extreme skepticism. They argued that a medieval bow could not compete with the effective range of a German Mauser Kar 98 rifle, which was accurate out to 500 meters. Jack Churchill disagreed based on a tactical calculation regarding the OODA loop, the decision cycle of observe, orient, decide, and act. He theorized that the crack of a supersonic bullet allows the enemy to instantly orient to the threat. They hear the shot, they identify the vector, and they take cover. But an arrow is subsonic. It is silent. It provides no auditory data for the enemy to process. Jack believed that in the confusion of a retreat, the silent elimination of a commander would cause a longer period of cognitive paralysis than a gunshot. He was about to test this hypothesis against the German army. To understand why a modern British officer was standing in a ditch in 1940 with a bow and arrow, one must analyze the anomaly of the man himself. Jack Churchill was a graduate of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, class of 1926. However, he found the peacetime army to be suffocating. He resigned his commission to seek adrenaline in the civilian world. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi. He rode a motorcycle across the entire length of Burma, navigating 1,500 miles of jungle and mountains alone, a feat of endurance that required immense physical resilience. He appeared as a professional archer in the Hollywood movie The Thief of Baghdad and had a minor role in Ivanhoe, using his skills on the silver screen. In 1939, he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway. He was not a hobbyist. He was an elite marksman who understood ballistics better than most artillery officers. When the war broke out, he rushed back to the colors, bringing his eccentric but lethal philosophy with him. He famously stated to his superiors that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. On the morning of May 27th, the theory was put into practice. Jack deployed his men in an ambush formation inside a darkened barn overlooking the road to Épinay. The German advance in this sector was led by a reconnaissance patrol. Intelligence reports indicated that the German units were confident, having met little organized resistance for 3 days. Jack's orders to his men were strict: absolute silence, no engagement until he initiated contact. In a standard British infantry doctrine, the signal to open fire would be a whistle blast or a burst from a Bren light machine gun. Jack's signal was the release of his bowstring. Jack moved to a position behind a low stone wall. He watched the road through the morning mist. A German squad appeared, marching in column formation. At the front walked a Feldwebel, a senior sergeant. He was the unit commander. He was scanning the perimeter, looking for the silhouette of a British helmet or the glint of a rifle barrel. He was analyzing the terrain for modern threats. He was not looking for a medieval archer. The distance was approximately 30 yards. Jack stood up. He drew the bowstring to his anchor point at his ear. At this range, the archer must account for the arching trajectory of the projectile. It is not a point-and-shoot mechanic like a firearm. It requires an instinctive calculation of angle and velocity. Jack held the draw for 2 seconds. The tension in the bow was at its maximum. He released. The physics of the shot were devastating. The arrow left the bow with 0 muzzle flash and 0 noise. It crossed the 30-yard gap in less than 0.5 seconds. The German sergeant, alert and listening for the sound of a bolt-action rifle, heard nothing. The arrow struck him in the center of the left chest cavity. The steel broadhead, designed centuries ago to cut through hardened leather and wool, sliced through his ribs and pierced the heart. The terminal ballistics were immediate. The sergeant collapsed. The reaction of the remaining German soldiers confirmed Jack's psychological theory. They did not dive for cover. They did not return fire. They froze. They stared at the wooden shaft sticking out of their commander's chest. Their brains could not process the data. There was no gunshot to react to. This cognitive delay lasted approximately 5 seconds. In close quarters combat, 5 seconds is an eternity. It was enough time for Jack to signal his machine gunners. The British troops opened fire on the paralyzed German squad. The patrol was neutralized before they could effectively deploy their weapons. Jack Churchill had recorded the only confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. The ambush at El Epinete was a tactical success, but a strategic irrelevance. The German pincers were closing. The order came to retreat to Dunkirk. For the next 3 days, Jack fought a desperate rearguard action. It was during this phase that his second weapon became legendary. Jack carried a basket-hilted Scottish claymore sword. Weighing nearly 3 pounds with a double-edged blade, it was an anachronism in 1940. But Jack argued that the sword had a psychological weight that a bayonet lacked. A bayonet is a secondary attachment to a rifle. A sword is a primary declaration of intent. During the fighting near the town of Hesdin, Jack was leading a counterattack when he was struck in the neck by a German machine gun bullet. The wound was serious, missing his jugular vein by millimeters. Most officers would have been evacuated on a stretcher. Jack bandaged the wound himself and continued to command. The retreat to Dunkirk was a scene of industrial chaos. Oil tanks were burning, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Ships were sinking in the harbor. Men were discarding their heavy equipment to swim to the boats. Discipline was breaking down. Amidst this collapse, Jack Churchill provided a surreal image of defiance. He walked onto the sand carrying his bow, his arrows, and his sword. He refused to abandon the tools of his trade. Witnesses reported seeing an officer with a bandaged neck and a broadsword directing brave men onto the boats while Luftwaffe bombers attacked from above. He boarded a destroyer, exhausted but armed, and returned to England. In June 1940, the British Army was broken. Most of its heavy equipment, including hundreds of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, had been left in France. The mood in London was defensive. Generals were planning how to stop a German invasion of the home islands. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a different approach. He issued a directive to the chiefs of staff proposing the creation of a new force. He wanted specially trained troops of the hunter class who could unleash a reign of terror down the enemy coast. This was the birth of the Special Service Brigade, later known as the Commandos. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. The Commando training regiment at Eccentric in Scotland was designed to weed out the weak. It utilized live ammunition during exercises. It required marches of 50 miles in 24 hours. It focused on silent killing, knife fighting, and night navigation. It was a return to primitive warfare, exactly what Jack had been advocating for. Jack excelled in this environment. He was appointed second in command of No. 3 Commando. It was here that he introduced the third element of his triad, the bagpipes. Jack was not Scottish by birth, but he understood the martial history of the instrument. In the Highland regiments, the piper was often the primary target because the music drove the men forward. Jack reasoned that the sound of bagpipes in the middle of a modern firefight would be deeply disorienting to the German defenders. It signaled a lack of fear. It signaled that the attackers were not just soldiers, but warriors. He learned to play a tune called the March of the Cameron Men. He integrated the instrument into his tactical planning. The stage was now set for the first major test of Jack's philosophy. The target was the German garrison on the island of Vågsø in Norway. The mission was Operation Archery. Jack Churchill was about to take his medieval weapons on the offensive. He was about to prove that a man with a sword could lead a modern amphibious assault against fortified bunkers. The physics of the arrow had been proven in France. Now, it was time to test the psychology of the sword in Norway. The legend of Mad Jack was just beginning. The summer of 1940 marked a fundamental shift in the grand strategy of the British Empire. The evacuation at Dunkirk had saved the personnel of the British Expeditionary Force, but it had left the army without heavy weapons and without a foothold on the European continent. The German Wehrmacht controlled the coastlines from Norway to France. A conventional invasion to retake Europe was mathematically impossible with the resources available. In this vacuum of offensive capability, Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a directive to the Imperial General Staff. He ordered the creation of a new type of unit, specially trained troops of the hunter class who could unleash a reign of terror down the enemy coast. This directive, dated June 1940, led to the formation of the Special Service Brigade, the units that would become known to history simply as the Commandos. For Captain Jack Churchill, this new organization was the answer to a tactical frustration. He had found the regular army to be too rigid, too dependent on static defensive lines, and too slow to adapt to the chaotic reality of modern combat. The Commando Training Center was established at Eccentric Castle in the Scottish Highlands. The curriculum was designed to break the average soldier. It utilized live ammunition during training exercises to desensitize the men to the sound of incoming fire. It required marches of 50 miles in 24 hours over rugged terrain to build endurance that exceeded human norms. It focused on silent killing, knife fighting, amphibious landings, and night navigation. It was a return to primitive, individualistic warfare, exactly the environment where Jack Churchill thrived. Jack was appointed second in command of No. 3 Commando. It was during this training phase that he fully integrated his medieval philosophy into a modern tactical doctrine. He argued that the reliance on technology made soldiers mentally weak. A soldier who relies on a radio can be jammed. A soldier who relies on artillery can be outmaneuvered. But a soldier who relies on his own aggression and a blade cannot be stopped by a technical malfunction. To reinforce this, Jack solidified his personal combat loadout. He carried his English longbow. He carried his basket-hilted Scottish claymore, a broadsword with a 33-inch double-edged blade. And he added a third element that baffled his superiors, a set of bagpipes. To the modern military mind, carrying a musical instrument into a stealth operation is a contradiction. But Jack Churchill was operating on a different psychological frequency. He understood the history of warfare. For thousands of years, armies had used sound to coordinate movement and intimidate the enemy. The Romans used trumpets. The Mongols used war drums. Jack reasoned that the German soldier was disciplined but rigid. He was trained to respond to the mechanical sounds of war, gunfire, engines, sirens. He was not trained to process the sound of the march of the Cameron men, played on bagpipes in the middle of a firefight. Jack calculated that this auditory anomaly would cause a moment of cognitive dissonance in the enemy. They would pause to identify the sound. In that pause, Jack intended to kill them. He viewed the bagpipes not as an instrument, but as a psychological weapon designed to project dominance. The testing ground for this theory was set for December 27, 1941. The mission was codenamed Operation Archery. The target was the German garrison on the island of Vagsø in German-occupied Norway. The strategic objective was twofold. First, to destroy the fish oil factories on the island. The Germans used fish oil to extract glycerin, a key ingredient in the manufacture of high explosives. By destroying the production facilities, the British could disrupt the German ammunition supply chain. Second, the raid was designed to force Adolf Hitler to reinforce Norway, drawing troops away from the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union was fighting for its survival. The assault force consisted of 570 men from No. 3 Commando, supported by the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Kenya, and 4 destroyers. The plan called for a dawn assault. The commandos would land at 4 separate points to encircle the town of Mao and the surrounding batteries. Jack Churchill was tasked with leading the assault on the German coastal battery on Molly Island, a fortified position that commanded the entrance to the fjord. At 0830 hours on December 27th, the Royal Navy began a 10-minute bombardment of the German positions. The sound was deafening. 500-pound shells slammed into the German bunkers, throwing snow and concrete into the air. But as the landing craft approached the shore, the bombardment ceased. The smoke hung heavy over the freezing water. The German defenders, shaken but alive, manned their MG-34 machine guns and looked out into the mist, waiting for the British infantry to appear. They did not hear the sound of engines. They heard a melody. Standing at the very prow of the lead landing craft assault, totally exposed to the freezing wind and potential enemy fire, was Jack Churchill. He was not wearing a helmet. He was wearing his service cap. He was playing the bagpipes. As the boat cut through the icy water, the sound of the pipes drifted over the waves. Inside the German bunkers, the confusion was absolute. The defenders hesitated. Was this a psychological trick? Was it a recording? As the landing craft hit the rocky shingle of the beach, the ramp dropped. The moment the steel hit the stones, Jack threw the bagpipes aside. He drew his claymore sword with his right hand and a grenade with his left. He raised the sword high above his head and screamed, "Commandos!" He leaped into the waist-deep water and sprinted toward the enemy wire. The physics of a sword charge in 1941 are terrified to contemplate. A modern assault rifle allows a soldier to engage from 300 meters. A sword requires the user to close the distance to 0. To do this, Jack had to run through the kill zone of the German machine guns. But the psychological effect of his charge acted as a shield. The German gunners, seeing a man sprinting at them with a sword, were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the image. It disrupted their targeting cycle. By the time they recovered, Jack and his men were inside the perimeter. Jack led the charge up the steep, snowy slopes toward the heavy gun battery. The fighting was brutal in close range. This was where the sword proved its utility. In the tight confines of the trenches and bunkers, a long rifle was clumsy. A sword was fast. Jack moved through the position, directing his men with the blade. When they reached the concrete command bunker, Jack sheathed his sword, pulled the pin on a Mills bomb grenade, and tossed it through the firing slit. The explosion silenced the position. Within 20 minutes, the battery on Mall Island was secured. Jack Churchill signaled the success to the main force using a whistle, but the battle for the town of Malloy was still raging. The commandos moved house to house, fighting the Gebirgsjäger, the elite German mountain troops. Jack moved to the town to coordinate the demolition teams. An incident during the street fighting illustrates Jack's complete detachment from fear. A demolition team was preparing to blow up a large fish oil factory. The charges were set with a short fuse. The commandos took cover behind a stone wall, waiting for the blast. Jack Churchill did not take cover. He stood in the middle of the street, checking his wristwatch, calmly observing the factory. When the explosives detonated, sending a massive fireball of burning oil and debris into the sky, Jack merely nodded, marked the time in his notebook, and moved to the next objective. To him, the explosion was just a chemical reaction. It was not something to be feared. By 1400 hours, the operation was complete. The British forces began to withdraw. The results of Operation Archery were mathematically devastating for the Germans. The fish oil factories were leveled. 15,000 tons of German shipping had been sunk in the harbor. 98 German prisoners were captured and taken back to England for interrogation. But the most significant damage was inflicted on the mind of Adolf Hitler. When the report of the raid reached Berlin, Hitler was furious. He read the accounts of the British commandos landing with specialized equipment and aggressive tactics. He became convinced that this raid was a prelude to a full-scale Allied invasion of Norway. Hitler famously declared that Norway is the zone of destiny in this war. He believed that if the Allies captured Norway, they could threaten Germany from the north and sever the supply lines of Swedish iron ore. Because of this paranoia, fueled by the aggression of Jack Churchill and No. 3 Commando, Hitler ordered a massive reinforcement of the Scandinavian peninsula. He moved the battleship Tirpitz to Norwegian waters. More importantly, he transferred 30,000 additional troops to Norway. Later in the war, this number would swell to nearly 300,000 German soldiers. These were elite divisions, heavily armed and armored, who spent the rest of the war sitting in Norwegian garrisons, waiting for an invasion that never came. These 300,000 men were desperately needed on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad and on the Western Front at Normandy. They were removed from the strategic board because of a raid led by a man with a sword. Jack Churchill's tactical gamble had resulted in a massive strategic victory. He had used a few hundred men to pin down an entire army. Jack was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership at Vagsø. His reputation as Mad Jack was solidified in the British press, but Jack was not interested in medals. He was interested in the next fight. The war was shifting south. The Allies were preparing to invade the soft underbelly of Europe. The mountains of Italy were waiting. In 1943, Jack was given command of No. 2 Commando. His mission was to spearhead the invasion of Salerno. The terrain in Italy was different from Norway. It was steep, hot, and defended by panzer divisions. But Jack's philosophy remained the same. He believed that the sword and the bow were still viable weapons of war. He believed that the shock of the old world could break the discipline of the new. He was about to put that theory to the ultimate test in a village called Pigolti, where he would face an entire German garrison alone, in the dark, with nothing but his blade and a bluff. The stage was set for the most impossible feat of Jack Churchill's career, the capture of 42 men without firing a shot. The events of that night would defy all probability and cement his place as the deadliest anachronism of the 20th century. But first, he had to get off the beach at Salerno alive. And the Germans were waiting for him. At 0330 hours on September 9, 1943, the ramps of the British landing craft infantry dropped into the surf at the Gulf of Salerno. Operation Avalanche, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy, had commenced. The tactical situation was immediately catastrophic. The invasion force was facing the German 16th Panzer Division, a unit hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front. They held the high ground of the Sorrento Peninsula, looking down the throat of the Allied landing zones. The beaches were pre-sighted by German 81mm mortar crews and MG-42 machine gun teams. The air was filled with the terrifying scream of Nebelwerfer rockets and the roar of Stuka dive bombers. Into this industrial cauldron of high-explosive violence stepped Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, commanding No. 2 Commando. While other officers were shouting into radios and scrambling for cover behind sand dunes, Jack Churchill was operating on a different psychological frequency. He stepped off the landing craft holding his basket-hilted claymore sword in his right hand. He was not wearing a helmet. He ordered the unit's bagpiper to play a tune. Amidst the deafening noise of the artillery barrage, the high-pitched, piercing sound of the pipes provided a bizarre acoustic anchor for the British troops. It signaled that their commander was not taking cover. He was advancing. No. 2 Commando pushed off the beach and into the steep, terraced vineyards surrounding the town of Vitry-sur-Mer. The fighting was vertical. The terrain favored the defender. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were dug into the rocky hillsides. These were elite troops, armed with FG-42 automatic rifles and stick grenades. Jack led his men up the defiles, utilizing the darkness and the dense vegetation to close the distance. By dawn, the commandos had secured the town, preventing the German armor from reaching the beachhead. But the battle was far from over. For the next 5 days, the battle raged for control of the Dragon Valley. The key to the entire sector was a village called Pigolti, situated on a limestone ridge commanding the valley floor. If the Germans held Pigolti, they could direct artillery fire onto the landing beaches with devastating accuracy. The Allied advance had stalled. Casualties were mounting. The tactical manual dictated that a battalion-sized force, approximately 800 men, was needed to dislodge the German defenders. Jack Churchill did not have a battalion. He had a depleted commando unit. He decided to take the village using a force of 2 men. On the night of September 15, 1943, Jack formulated a plan that relied entirely on the psychology of fear and the element of sensory deprivation. He reasoned that the German sentries were exhausted. They had been fighting for a week without rotation. In the pitch-black conditions of the mountains, military discipline relies heavily on communication and visibility. If those 2 factors are removed, a unit becomes fragile. Jack decided to infiltrate the German lines alone, accompanied only by a corporal named Ruffel. Jack made a critical equipment decision before leaving the perimeter. He left his American M1 carbine behind. He argued that the temptation to fire a gun would be too high, and a single gunshot would alert the entire garrison. Instead, he took his sword, his Webley Mark VI revolver, and a belt of grenades. He instructed Corporal Ruffel to stay 5 paces behind him and to not fire unless absolutely necessary. At 0200 hours, Jack and Corporal Ruffel moved silently up the goat tracks leading to Pigolti. The darkness was absolute. Jack was operating on instinct honed during his pre-war motorcycle treks across the jungles of Burma. He spotted the first German fighting position. It was a mortar pit. The crew was huddled around a small stove, trying to stay warm. They were looking down into the valley, expecting a massive Allied assault from the front. They were not watching their immediate perimeter. Jack signaled Ruffel to stay back. He drew his sword. The metal made a soft hiss as it left the scabbard. He crept to within 10 yards of the pit. Then he sprinted. He did not scream this time. He appeared out of the darkness like a phantom. He placed the tip of his sword against the neck of the nearest sentry. The psychological shock was total. The German soldier, terrified by the sudden appearance of a man with a medieval weapon in the middle of a modern war, dropped his rifle. Jack whispered a single command: "Handle Hawk, hands up." The sentry surrendered. His comrades, confused and unable to see how many attackers were in the darkness, followed suit. But Jack did not stop there. This is where his tactical genius came into play. He knew that prisoners were a liability unless they were used as assets. He tied the prisoners together. He then used the German sentry as a human shield and forced him to walk toward the next machine gun post. When the sentries at the second post saw their comrade approaching, they hesitated. They lowered their weapons, assuming it was a relief detail or a message runner. In that moment of hesitation, Jack stepped out from the shadows, sword raised. He repeated the command. The German soldiers, believing they were surrounded by a superior force, surrendered without firing a shot. This process repeated itself with mathematical precision. Post after post fell to the bluff. Jack moved through the village like a virus, dismantling the defensive line one squad at a time. He moved to the command post. He captured the officers who were sleeping. He moved to the ammunition dump. He captured the guards. By 0400 hours, the operation was complete. Jack Churchill began the march back to the Allied lines. The British sentry at the perimeter checkpoint heard the sound of marching feet. He raised his Thompson submachine gun, expecting a German counterattack. Then he froze. Walking out of the mist was Jack Churchill. Behind him was a column of 42 German prisoners. They were carrying their own mortars, their own ammunition, and their own shame. Jack had captured an entire garrison without firing a single shot. He had suffered 0 casualties. He had expended 0 rounds of ammunition. He had simply used the sword to leverage fear. The prisoners included an entire mortar squad and the officers responsible for holding the ridge. The report of the action at Pigolti reached the highest levels of Allied command. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was reportedly stunned by the after-action report. He described it as one of the most astonishing feats of the war. It defied all military logic. A single officer and a corporal had neutralized a reinforced platoon in fortified positions. The capture of Pigolti became a case study in special operations. It proved that in the chaotic environment of war, the mind is the primary target. If you can break the enemy's perception of reality, their weapons become useless. The Germans were humiliated. The interrogation of the prisoners revealed the extent of the psychological damage. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, trained to fight the best armies in Europe, and they had been captured by a crazy man with a knife. They claimed they thought they were surrounded by hundreds of commandos. They could not accept that it was just one man. Jack was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for Pigolti, but his war was not over. The Italian campaign was grinding into a stalemate of attrition. The British High Command needed Jack's specific set of skills elsewhere. They needed him in the Balkans. In January 1944, Jack was transferred to the Adriatic Theater. The target was Yugoslavia. The resistance movement there, the partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, was fighting a desperate guerrilla war against the German occupation. The Germans had committed 90,000 troops to crush the resistance. They controlled the mainland and most of the islands. The only Allied foothold was the island of Vis. It was a fortress of rock and caves, besieged by the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Jack arrived on Vis to take command of a mixed force of commandos and partisans. His orders were to disrupt German shipping and launch raids against the garrisons on the neighboring island of Brac. The culture clash on Vis was immediate. The partisans were rugged, undisciplined, and fiercely brave. They had never seen an officer like Jack Churchill. He played the bagpipes during briefings. He practiced archery on the beach. He led raids wearing a kilt. They called him the British madman, but they followed him with fanatical devotion because he led from the front. Jack's time in Italy had proven that the sword could defeat the machine, but Yugoslavia would test him in a different way. The terrain was harsher, the enemy was more ruthless, and the odds were stacking up against him. The events that were about to unfold on a hill designated 622 would push Jack Churchill to the absolute limit of human endurance. He was about to walk into a trap that no amount of psychological warfare could break. The sword had won at Pigolti, but on the island of Brac, the mortars were waiting. In January 1944, the trajectory of Jack Churchill's war shifted from the structured chaos of Italy to the feral guerrilla warfare of the Balkans. The British Special Operations Executive transferred him to the Adriatic Theater to support the Yugoslav partisans. The strategic situation was grim. The German Wehrmacht had committed 90,000 troops to crush the resistance movement led by Josip Broz Tito. They controlled the entire mainland and every major island in the Dalmatian archipelago, except one, the island of Vis. Vis was a fortress of rock and caves, located 30 miles off the coast of Split. It was the only Allied foothold in the Adriatic, besieged daily by the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Jack arrived on Vis to take command of a mixed force of No. 2 Commando and a detachment of Highland Light Infantry. His mission was to organize the defense of the island and launch aggressive raids against the German garrisons on the neighboring island of Brac. The arrival of Jack Churchill on Vis created an immediate culture shock. The Yugoslav partisans were rugged, undisciplined irregulars who had spent years fighting a brutal war of extermination against the SS. They had never seen an officer like Jack. He disembarked wearing his kilt, carrying his basket-hilted claymore sword and playing the bagpipes. He set up an archery range on the beach to practice his marksmanship between raids. The partisans, who valued bravery above all else, were mesmerized. They called him the British madman. A bond formed between the medieval warrior and the communist guerrillas, forged in a shared philosophy of aggression. For 5 months, Jack led raids against German shipping and coastal batteries. But the strategic stalemate broke in May 1944. The Germans launched Operation Wurselsprung, a massive airborne assault on Tito's headquarters in the mountains of Diyarbakir. To relieve the pressure on Tito, the British High Command ordered Jack to launch a full-scale assault on the island of Brac. The objective was to force the Germans to divert reinforcements away from the mainland. The target was a fortified elevation designated as Hill 622. It was the highest point on the island, a limestone peak turned into a modern fortress. The German 118th Jägerdivision had spent months fortifying the hill. They had constructed a network of interlocking bunkers, concrete machine gun nests, and belts of barbed wire. The approaches were mined. The kill zones were pre-sighted by 81mm mortars. Operation Flounced commenced on June 2, 1944. The tactical plan was flawed from the start. The terrain was too rugged for a night assault, forcing Jack to attack in broad daylight. The plan relied on a massive airstrike by the Royal Air Force to suppress the German defenses. At 0800 hours, a squadron of Spitfires and Mustangs descended on Hill 622. They strafed the summit with 20mm cannons and rockets. But the dense Mediterranean scrub brush absorbed the fire. The concrete bunkers remained intact. The Germans were waiting. Jack Churchill was commanding the primary assault force, consisting of No. 40 Commando and a battalion of partisans. As they emerged from the tree line at the base of the hill, the German defense grid opened fire. It was a wall of steel. The MG-42 machine guns, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, tore through the ranks of the attackers. The partisan units on the flanks were pinned down immediately. Their communications were cut. The attack stalled before it had even begun. Jack Churchill analyzed the physics of the battlefield. He realized that if his men stayed on the open slope, they would be massacred by mortar fire. The only way to survive was to close the distance. He had to generate momentum. Jack stood up in the middle of the firestorm. He was not holding a rifle. He was holding his sword in one hand and his bagpipes in the other. He signaled the advance not with a radio but with a melody. He began to play "The Campbells Are Coming." The sight of their commander walking upright through a barrage of shrapnel defied all logic. It shamed the men into moving. 40 commando rose from the scrub and followed the music. They climbed the sheer face of the hill, throwing grenades into the German trenches. The casualties were horrific. Men were falling every yard. But Jack kept climbing, the sound of the pipes cutting through the explosions. By the time they breached the first line of barbed wire, the force had been decimated. Jack led the final charge to the summit using his sword to cut through the obstacles. When he reached the top, he took cover in a shallow depression near the main German command bunker. He looked around to rally his men. He realized with a cold certainty that there was no one left to rally. Of the hundreds of men who had started the assault, only 6 commandos had made it to the summit with him. They were cut off. They were surrounded. The Germans, realizing the attack had failed, launched a counterattack to wipe out the survivors. They did not expose themselves. They simply stayed in their bunkers and rolled stick grenades down the slope into the depression. It was a killing box. One by one, the men next to Jack were killed or incapacitated. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Jack's revolver was empty. His sword was chipped. He was bleeding from a concussion blast. The mathematics of the situation were final. There was no escape. There was no backup. At this moment, facing certain death on a limestone peak in Yugoslavia, Jack Churchill made a decision that defines his legend. He did not surrender. He did not try to run. He stood up. He reached into his pack and pulled out a fresh reed for his pipes. He put the instrument to his lips. The German infantry was advancing, rifles raised, expecting the British officer to open fire. Instead, they heard a song. Jack played "Will Ye No Come Back Again." It is a traditional Scottish song of lament, a song of goodbye. The eerie, mournful sound drifted over the battlefield, silencing the gunfire for a brief moment. The Germans paused, confused by the surreal image of a lone figure playing music amidst the slaughter. Then the spell broke. A German soldier threw a stick grenade. It landed at Jack's feet. He continued to play until the fuse burned down. The explosion knocked him off his feet. The blast wave caused a severe concussion, rendering him unconscious. When Jack Churchill woke up, he was being dragged by his arms across the rocky ground. He was dazed, deafened, and in pain. He looked up to see the faces of SS troopers standing over him. They had stripped him of his gear. They held his sword. They held his bagpipes. They were arguing over his identity. The German intelligence officer on the scene examined Jack's dog tags. Name: Churchill. Rank: Lieutenant Colonel. Religion: Church of England. The officer made a deductive leap that would change the course of Jack's war. He knew that the British Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. He assumed that this eccentric officer who fought with a sword and pipes must be a member of the British aristocracy, perhaps a son or a nephew of the Prime Minister himself. This error in genealogy saved Jack's life. Under the Hitler Commando Order of 1942, all captured Special Forces personnel were classified as terrorists and were to be executed immediately without trial. But a relative of Winston Churchill was a political asset. He was a bargaining chip of the highest value. The order came down to treat him with extreme caution. Jack was loaded onto a transport plane and flown directly to Berlin. He arrived at Tempelhof Airport in June 1944. He was taken to the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse for interrogation. The Nazi officials expected to interrogate a diplomat, a man of high breeding who would crumble under pressure. Instead, they faced a man who lectured them on the history of archery. During the interrogation, the Germans tried to leverage his supposed relationship with Winston Churchill. They asked him about the strategic plans of the British government. Jack simply smiled and told them that he was a soldier, not a politician, and that his only relationship to the Prime Minister was a shared surname. He refused to give up any operational intelligence about the partisan dispositions on Vis. He treated the Gestapo with a mixture of boredom and contempt. The Germans, frustrated but still terrified of accidentally killing a VIP, decided to place him in the most secure facility in the Third Reich. He was transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located 22 miles north of Berlin. He was not placed in the general population. He was assigned to the Sonderlager, a special high-security compound for the prominent prisoners. Jack was thrown into a concrete cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut, locking him in a windowless box. For a man who had spent his life navigating the open jungles and mountains, this confinement was a form of torture. But as Jack sat in the darkness, listening to the footsteps of the SS guards, he was not despairing. He was calculating. He was analyzing the thickness of the walls. He was counting the seconds between the searchlight sweeps. He was already planning the next phase of his war. The Germans thought they had captured a political hostage. They did not realize they had caged a predator. Jack Churchill was about to demonstrate that stone walls and electrified wire are no match for a man with a spoon and the patience of a hunter. The Battle of Hill 622 was over, but the Great Escape was about to begin. At 0900 hours on June 4, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill entered the gates of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Located 22 miles north of Berlin near the town of Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen was the heart of the SS camp system. It was not merely a prison. It was an architectural experiment in control. The camp was laid out in the shape of a perfect equilateral triangle. At the apex stood Tower A, the main guard tower armed with heavy machine guns. From this single geometric point, the SS could observe every inch of the roll call area. It was a panopticon designed to strip the inmates of privacy and hope. Jack Churchill was not placed in the general population, where thousands of Soviet prisoners and political dissidents were being worked to death in the brickworks. Because of the mistaken belief that he was a relative of Winston Churchill, Jack was classified as a prominent, a high-value hostage. He was assigned to the Sonderlager, the special camp. This was a prison within a prison, separated from the main compound by a high brick wall topped with electrified barbed wire and floodlights. Jack was thrown into a concrete cell measuring 5 feet by 9 feet. It had no windows, only a small ventilation slit near the ceiling. The door was heavy steel. For a man who had spent his life navigating the open jungles of Burma and the mountains of Italy, this confinement was a form of psychological torture designed to induce claustrophobia and despair. But Jack Churchill did not have a breaking point. He had a tactical mind. From the moment the door slammed shut, he began to analyze the architecture of his prison. He was not looking at the walls as barriers. He was looking at them as engineering problems. He began to observe the routine of the guards. The SS operated on a strict Germanic schedule. Shift changes occurred at 0600, 1400, and 2200 hours. The searchlights on the perimeter wall swept the compound in a rhythmic arc every 30 seconds. This left a predictable blind spot of darkness that lasted exactly 8 seconds. Jack memorized these intervals. He also analyzed the soil composition of the Brandenburg region. It was sandy and loose. This meant that digging would be fast, but the risk of a tunnel collapsing was mathematically high. He needed a structural solution, and he needed a partner. He found one in Wing Commander Bertram James, a Royal Air Force pilot who had already survived the legendary Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3. James was a master tunneler who understood the physics of excavation. Together, the archer and the pilot formulated a plan that seemed physically impossible. They would dig a tunnel from their barrack, go under the isolation wall, under the electrified wire, under the perimeter road, and emerge in the forest outside the camp. The distance was approximately 110 feet. The excavation began on September 1, 1944. They had no shovels. They had no picks. They had no timber for shoring up the roof. Jack found a discarded, rusty spoon in the refuse pile behind the mess hall. This spoon became their primary excavation tool. They selected a starting point in a blind spot behind the barrack, concealed by a small vegetable patch that the prisoners were allowed to cultivate. The work was agonizingly slow. The tunnel was only 12 inches wide, barely enough to accommodate the shoulders of a grown man. They had to crawl on their stomachs, scraping the earth away inch by inch. The air inside the shaft was thick with dust and carbon dioxide. The lack of oxygen caused frequent blackouts. But the biggest engineering challenge was the displacement of mass. A tunnel of that length creates cubic yards of waste dirt. If the guards saw a single pile of fresh yellow sand, the operation was over. Jack devised a disposal system. They pried up the floorboards of their cell and packed the dirt into the crawl space underneath. When that space filled up, they began filling their pockets with dirt and flushing it down the latrine in small handfuls during the day. It was a war of attrition. For 3 weeks they worked in shifts. One man dug while the other watched the guards. They encountered tree roots that had to be sawed through with a jagged piece of metal. They encountered rocks that had to be pried loose in absolute silence. They worked with the knowledge that discovery meant immediate execution. By September 23, 1944, the tunnel was ready. Jack calculated the distance by counting the number of body lengths he had crawled. They were past the wire. They were under the road. On the night of September 23rd, the meteorological conditions were mathematically perfect. A dense fog had rolled in from the Baltic Sea, reducing visibility to less than 10 yards. At 0100 hours, Jack Churchill lowered himself into the hole. He was wearing a civilian coat he had stolen from the laundry supply and a cap he had fashioned from a blanket. He carried no weapon, no food, and no map. He carried only a small compass he had constructed using a magnetized needle floating in a cup of water. He crawled through the 100-foot tube of darkness. The weight of the earth above him was pressing down. He reached the end of the tunnel and pushed upward. The ground broke. He felt the cold night air on his face. He pulled himself out of the hole and lay flat in the wet grass. He was outside. He signaled for James. The wing commander followed him. Within 5 minutes, both men were standing in the forest surrounding Sachsenhausen. They were free. But freedom in Nazi Germany in late 1944 was a relative concept. They were deep inside the Third Reich. Berlin was burning 20 miles to the south. The Russian Red Army was advancing from the east. The entire country was a militarized zone. Jack made a strategic decision. He told James that 2 men moving together looked like a patrol, but 1 man moving alone looked like a shadow. They shook hands and split up. Jack turned his face north. His objective was the port city of Rostock, 130 miles away. He hoped to stow away on a Swedish freighter crossing the Baltic Sea to neutral territory. The journey that followed was a test of human endurance that rivaled his motorcycle trek across Burma. Jack moved only at night. He navigated by the stars, keeping the North Star, Polaris, on his right shoulder. During the day, he hid in drainage ditches, buried under piles of leaves to stay warm. The temperature dropped below freezing. He had no caloric intake. He survived by raiding vegetable fields, eating raw turnips, cabbage, and carrots pulled from the frozen ground. He drank from cattle troughs. The SS launched a massive manhunt. The escape of a prominent prisoner was a catastrophe for the camp commandant. Tracking dogs were deployed. The Hitler Youth were mobilized to search the woods. Police units set up checkpoints at every bridge and crossroads, but Jack Churchill was a ghost. He used streams to mask his scent from the dogs. He moved through the deepest parts of the forest where vehicles could not follow. For 14 days, he evaded the entire security apparatus of the German state. He covered nearly 10 miles a night, despite suffering from hypothermia and starvation. By October 7th, Jack was within sight of the Baltic coast. He could smell the salt air. He was emaciated, his uniform was in rags, and he was hallucinating from hunger. But he was still moving. However, the geography of the region forced him into a funnel. To reach the docks at Rostock, he had to cross a series of bridges that spanned the coastal inlets. The Germans knew this. They had placed sentries on every crossing. On the morning of October 10, 1944, the mathematics of evasion finally failed. A thick fog that Jack was using for cover lifted unexpectedly. He was caught in the open, crossing a frost-covered field near the town of Mecklenburg. A patrol of the Volkssturm, the German Home Guard militia, spotted him. They were armed with rifles and accompanied by dogs. Jack attempted to reach the tree line, but he was cut off. He was surrounded. He had no weapon. His sword was gone. His bow was gone. He stood his ground, glaring at the militiamen. He looked so wild, so terrifying, that the German civilians were reportedly afraid to approach him. They kept their distance, rifles trained on his chest, until a unit of SS soldiers arrived to take him into custody. Jack was recaptured just a few miles from freedom. The SS officers who interrogated him were furious, but they were also grudgingly impressed. They could not understand how a man could walk 150 miles through a war zone with no supplies. Jack simply told them that he was a commando, and a commando finds a way. He was not returned to Sachsenhausen. The Germans decided that the camp was too close to the Russian lines. Instead, Jack was put on a transport train heading south. He was being moved to the Alpine fortress in Austria, where the Nazis planned to make their final stand. Jack Churchill was now heading toward the Tyrol Mountains. He was entering a chaotic landscape where the SS fanatics were preparing to execute their prisoners rather than let them be liberated. He was walking into a death trap. But as the train rattled south toward the Alps, Jack was not thinking about death. He was watching the guard rotations. He was checking the door hinges. He was looking for the next rusty spoon. The war was not over for Mad Jack Churchill. It was just entering its final, most dangerous phase. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was in a state of terminal collapse. The logistical arteries of the German war machine had been severed by Allied air power. In this chaos, Jack Churchill was moved once again. He was transferred from the cells of Berlin to the transport meant for the Alpenfestung, the mythical Alpine fortress where the Nazi fanatics intended to make their final stand. Jack was now part of a specific group of hostages known as the Prominent. These were 139 high-value prisoners, a collection of former prime ministers, generals, and family members of the German officers who had attempted to assassinate Hitler in Operation Valkyrie. The SS intended to use them as human shields or bargaining chips in the final negotiations. The convoy of prisoners arrived in the village of Niederdorf in the Austrian Tyrol on April 28, 1945. The geography was stunning but lethal. They were trapped in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, guarded by a detachment of SS Totenkopf troops commanded by Obersturmführer Edgar Stiller. The atmosphere in the village was volatile. The SS guards were heavily armed with MP-40 submachine guns and stick grenades. They were drinking schnapps heavily, aware that the war was lost and that they would likely hang for their crimes. On April 29th, a secret directive arrived from the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. The order was explicit and brutal. Under no circumstances were the Prominent to be allowed to fall into Allied hands alive. If the American or French forces approached the valley, The SS were instructed to execute the prisoners and burn the bodies to destroy the evidence. The method of execution was to be machine gun fire followed by flamethrowers. Jack Churchill, with his decades of combat experience, recognized the tactical shift immediately. He saw the guards checking their weapons. He saw the fear in their eyes. He realized that the execution was imminent. Jack took command of the prisoners. He identified the former military officers among the captives, including Colonel Bogislaw von Bohnen, a German staff officer who had been imprisoned for disobeying Hitler. Jack told the civilians to take cover in the hotel lobby. He told the men that they would not die on their knees. If the SS attempted to enter the prisoner compound, they would fight. They had no guns, but Jack began to stockpile rocks, heavy furniture, and kitchen knives. It was a medieval defense strategy against modern automatic weapons. However, Jack Churchill knew that a physical fight would result in a massacre. He needed a strategic intervention. He needed a force multiplier. He observed that the valley was not just occupied by the SS. A unit of the regular German army, the Wehrmacht 5th Mountain Division, was retreating through the area. These soldiers were combat veterans of the Eastern Front. They were exhausted, disillusioned, and they despised the SS fanatics who were trying to prolong a lost war. Jack realized that this friction between the two German forces was his only chance of survival. He needed to engineer a civil war within the enemy camp. Jack managed to send a secret message to the local Wehrmacht commander, Captain Richard von Alvensleben. The message was simple and appealed to the captain's sense of military honor. It stated that 139 unarmed prisoners, including women and children, were about to be murdered by a rogue SS detachment. Jack asked for protection. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, one of the most surreal engagements of the Second World War took place in the market square of Niederdorf. Captain von Alvensleben arrived at the prisoner compound. He did not come alone. He brought a heavily armed infantry company supported by heavy machine guns and a Panzerschreck anti-tank team. He deployed his men in combat positions facing the SS guards. It was Germans versus Germans. The Wehrmacht soldiers leveled their Kar 98 rifles at the SS troopers. Captain von Alvensleben walked into the square and issued an ultimatum to Obersturmführer Stiller. He stated that the prisoners were now under the protection of the Wehrmacht and that any attempt by the SS to harm them would be met with lethal force. The SS commander looked at the heavy machine guns aimed at his men. He looked at the grim faces of the Wehrmacht veterans. He realized he was outgunned and outnumbered. The SS capitulated. They abandoned their posts and fled into the mountains, leaving their weapons behind. The prisoners were technically free. The Wehrmacht unit withdrew, leaving the village undefended, but the situation was still critical. The valley was a no-man's land. Partisan bands were roaming the hills, shooting anything that moved. Retiring German columns were desperate for food and transport. The American Fifth Army was advancing from the south, but they were still days away. Most of the prominent decided to wait in the relative safety of the village hotel for the Americans to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He checked his map. The nearest Allied lines were in Verona, Italy, approximately 93 miles to the south. The route required crossing the Brenner Pass, one of the highest and most treacherous passes in the Alps. It was covered in snow and ice. Jack simply walked out of the hotel. He had no food supplies. He had no winter gear. He had no weapon. He began to walk. He navigated the Alps on foot, moving with the same determination that had carried him across Burma years before. He scavenged vegetables from abandoned farmhouses. He slept in haylofts to keep from freezing. He avoided the main roads, which were clogged with the wreckage of the retreating German army. He watched from the tree line as American P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German convoys in the valley floor. On May 4, 1945, An American armored reconnaissance unit near Verona saw a figure approaching their checkpoint. The soldiers raised their weapons. The figure was bearded, emaciated, and wearing a tattered British uniform that had not been washed in months, but he walked with the arrogance of a victor. Jack Churchill flagged down the lead jeep. He calmly informed the stunned American GI that he was a British lieutenant colonel and that he would like a hot meal. He had walked through the collapse of the Third Reich and survived. Jack was flown back to England. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. London erupted in celebration. Crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square to hear Winston Churchill speak. But Jack Churchill was not celebrating. He was frustrated. He felt that his imprisonment had caused him to miss the final year of the fighting. He looked at the global strategic map. Germany was defeated, but the Empire of Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. The British were preparing Operation Zipper, a massive amphibious invasion to retake Malaya and Singapore. Jack volunteered immediately. He was reinstated as a lieutenant colonel and shipped to Burma. His plan was to join the fight against the Imperial Japanese Army. He acquired a new basket-hilted claymore sword. He commissioned a new longbow from a maker in London. He told his men that the dense jungles of Southeast Asia were the perfect environment for his silent, close-quarters weapons. He anticipated a bloody campaign that would last another 2 years. He was eager to test his medieval theories against the Japanese code of Bushido. He believed that the Japanese, who culturally respected the sword, would be a worthy opponent for his tactics. But technology intervened once again. In August 1945, while Jack was in India preparing for the invasion, the United States Army Air Forces dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sheer destructive power of these weapons forced the Japanese surrender on August 15th. The war ended instantly. When the news reached Jack Churchill, he did not cheer. He was furious. He famously threw his briefcase across the room and shouted, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. To Jack, the atomic bomb was the ultimate insult. It was the victory of the machine over the warrior. It was impersonal, distant, and instantaneous. It was everything he hated. Jack Churchill's war was over, but his life as a warrior was not. At the age of 40, he refused to retire to a desk job. He qualified as a paratrooper, earning his jump wings. In 1948, he transferred to the Seaforth Highlanders and was deployed to Palestine during the chaotic end of the British Mandate. On April 13, 1948, he was one of the few British officers to intervene in the Hadassah medical convoy ambush. When Arab forces attacked a convoy of Jewish doctors and nurses, Jack ordered his small unit to provide cover fire. When the British High Command ordered him to stay out of the conflict, he ignored them. He walked into the line of fire in full uniform, smiling, and coordinated the evacuation of the survivors. It was the last time he would face enemy fire. In his later years, Jack Churchill's eccentricity found new outlets. In 1955, he became the first man to surf the Severn Bore, a massive tidal wave that sweeps up the River Severn in England. He designed his own surfboards. He continued to play the bagpipes. Commuters taking the train from his home into London witnessed a strange daily ritual. Every evening, as the train passed his backyard, Jack would open the window of the moving carriage and throw his briefcase out into his garden. When asked why, he explained that the briefcase was heavy and he didn't want to carry it home from the station. It was a purely logical solution to a physical problem, just like using a bow in a gunfight. Jack Churchill died in 1996 at the age of 89. He passed away peacefully in his home in Surrey. In the end, the man who sought danger his entire life died of old age. Historians often struggle to categorize him. Was he insane? Was he a relic? Or was he a genius? The ambush at El Epinette, the raid on Vauxhall, the capture of Pigolti, and the standoff at Hill 622 suggests that Jack was not crazy. He was a master of asymmetric warfare. He understood that in a world of standardized military doctrine, the man who does the unexpected holds the advantage. He proved that technology does not always dictate the outcome of a battle. He proved that 50,000 years of human hunting instinct does not disappear just because someone invented the machine gun. He was the last medieval warrior. He was the only man to fight the Second World War with a longbow, a bagpipe, and a broadsword. And in the archives of military history, there will never be another one like him. If you want to uncover more stories about the men and machines that defied the laws of war, make sure to subscribe to this channel. The history books are full of shadows, and we intend to explore them all. See you in the next mission.